I saw a question about how do you prevent the player from walking off the edge? I don't know what solution you... I don't remember who asked it.
That's a good question.
That's pertinent for sure. So Unity comes with a Navmesh system, which typically is used for letting enemies figure out how to get to the player or how to navigate up a hillside or whatever. But it's also just a really nice low resolution, low geometric resolution representation of the world. And I guess I can probably, if I do, that's Chrome, window, normally I do this search. That's probably safe to do.
Yeah. Good call. Sin Alex in the chat says, I definitely expected it to be a vertex shader displacement. Well, there you go. I guess back to the grass. Yeah.
Is it navigation? I don't remember where navigation is. I guess I could pop to my actual layout here.
Okay.
I hope there's no secrets. So yeah, you can see.
Oh, there we go. Perfect.
There's your Navmesh. So this is used. This has double duty. This is used for for enemies to find out, say, how to get to the player. But It can also be sampled. So you can say, hey, given this point, what's a nearby point on the Navmesh? And you can use this to make sure that the player doesn't, fall off edges. And you can also do some tricks to make sure that they can fall off edges in certain circumstances.
Oh, interesting.
Which gets sort of tricky as well.
So it's one Navmesh, but you're using it for two different purposes. You're calling on it for two different things, for the enemies, but also for the player, and limiting them, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool.
In this case, there are two Navmeshes because there's another one for sort of wider enemies that can't fit through certain gaps. So enemy behavior, they will have a Navmesh agent on them,
okay.
Which, if you let a Navmesh agent do your work for you, it will, by default, sort of move to whatever target you want. But you don't need to necessarily do that. You can just consult the Navmesh agent and say, hey, which direction would you want to go?
Right.
And then you can use that information to feed it into an animation controller via parameters. So you can take that and say, well, I know you want to go that way, but that way is behind you. So I'm going to say you want to travel behind you, or you could say you want to turn 180 degrees. That means that you can use information about the Navmesh to drive root motion-based enemy behavior, which is really nice and cool. It means that you can scale your enemies appropriately, and their footfall sort of makes sense. That is, it's a bit of a strange chain to go from a Navmesh agent to all the way through that chain to actually moving it in on a domain move and having that in turn talk to the physics system to move the rigid body that represents the monster. But by doing that, you get a nice effect of having the Navmesh tell you where you want to go, the physics system work properly so that enemies can bump into things and move around debris.
Right.
And also have the advantage of doing root motion and all the benefits that gives.
Okay.
So here's an example of don't look at my shame, all the animation graphs.
Don't worry, it's always like that.
It's always like this, don't worry.
Yeah, it's always like this.
It is what it is.
I won't show you the player character one, but what I could show you is when I was first doing animations in Unity, authoring them with the Unity animation system, it was very straightforward to do things like turn colliders on and off. As an enemy swings a sword, you turn its collider on at a particular point, you turn it off at a particular point. When authoring things in Blender, I've never found an especially good way to have information from Blender move over into Unity. There are ways of doing it, but they didn't have that same degree of control. So the sort of middle ground that I ended up using was animation curves. So supplementing animations in the animation import.
Nice. So maybe you could show that to us.
Yeah, absolutely. So if I don't know what this is. Oh, don't open an Autodesk preview. If I'm going to have to... I made all these views in the hopes that they would be easier to see. But now I'm trying to just run around the whole project, and I'm not used to seeing things. So I'm just
no worries. Original ones. And if you have any questions, again, for Joyce or Andrew, please throw them in the chat, and I'll ask them right now. We have one question, unrelated, but what's the cat's name? I have no idea which cat you're speaking about. Is there a cat next to me?
Well, my cat just woke up. I'm not even sitting on my desk chair. I'm sitting on like a terrible kitchen chair.
Oh, okay. So you have to answer the question. What's the cat's name, Joyce?
If it was my cat, it's Biscuit.
There we go. It's Biscuit. There you go. There's your answer.
So after importing an animation from Blender, if I wanted to augment it with things like how fast does this enemy turn to face the player when they're attacking? So part of the design of the game is that the orientation of enemies is really important.
Right.
And so being able to control which parts of the animation it's allowed to turn to face you is so here at the beginning, the enemy can turn to face you, but once they start their wind up, they're sort of locked into their animation when they do this way. You can see there's also a curve for whether or not the hitbox of their sword is going to damage you. So if you just run up to them when they're not attacking, it's fine.
So this is very like animation-based combat, right? So it's not like there's like a sphere spawning in front of, like a sphere hitbox spawning in front of the enemy. The collider or hitbox is actually the sword itself. So it's similar to maybe Dark Souls in that way? Am I mistaken, or is that right?
Yeah, totally. So that's if you're swinging your sword, but it hasn't yet made contact with the enemy, Oh,
that's really cool.
And that has some interesting side effects. It means that you can watch enemies hit other enemies sometimes.
Oh, nice.
Be able to do damage to them, or if you without having too many spoilers, there's an enemy later on that has a big wide attack, and if you happen to hit it at just the right time so it flinches, it's possible for that big wide attack to just sort of skip over your head.
Oh, great.
Because everything is very physically based.
Okay, so it's very fair in that way, where if you get hit, it's because you got hit by exactly the point of the sword or something along those lines. So I like that kind of gameplay.
There's a lot of control afforded by adjusting these curves and adding, where is this enemy especially vulnerable? Where does this attack work against them or not work against them? It's also used, this is a very simple early enemy, so there's not a whole lot going on, but there are other more complex things like bosses where visual effects, whether or not this particle system is playing, or if this trail is being rendered, or even things like how hotly emissive is this material, can all be controlled with animation curves.
And how about that boss behavior? You mentioned that just now, just a second ago. How does that come into all of this?
So each boss is a little bit different. I won't show any big bosses or anything like that.
Okay.
I don't want to spoil anybody.
Save it for the game. Get the game. It's out.
But one technique that I found that is sort of neat. I don't know in the end how useful it will be across the board, but someone might find it interesting, is to have this sort of delegate-based system where let's say you've got a thing where you say, okay, enemies in a particular space, it's in front of you're directly in front of the boss or whatever, or you're behind it and the boss needs to make a decision about how it's going to behave in that circumstance. You can sort of roll a die by having a series of delegates in a function that has I forget what it's called in C#, but like a parameter, like an arbitrarily long list of arguments or parameters provided to a function. And that's sort of a fun way to do this, where you've got a bunch of delegates that have individual behaviors, and sort of building this sort of deck of cards that the boss can choose from. Some of them even, you can do stuff like throw something in twice if you want it to happen twice as frequently.
Oh, okay, nice.
I think there's at least one boss where this is actually modeled like a deck of cards, where it's got a particular sequence, and it uses that same sequence repeatedly, but it shuffles it each time. So certain attacks will only appear once in a given amount of time. And it's possible that it will appear right after itself if the shuffling happens to work out that way, but it keeps the sort of distribution of behavior interesting.
Yeah, is there sometimes like a mix of the two where there's some predetermined behavior, but also based off of your positioning, the decisions the boss makes will change depending. Let's say you're far away, they'll start to shoot projectiles. You get closer, they'll start another sequence. Is there like that combination there as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And each one of the bosses is different, so it's give and take, sort of like design wise and implementation wise, to figure out how best to get the effect that you want.